Hey there, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about growing herbs. Growing herbs is where many gardeners begin. They're easy to grow, especially in a small space. They are perfect for container gardening. Most of them, or many of them, survive year after year without having to replant. And to me, they present the most potential savings compared to their store-bought counterpart. I've been growing herbs for my entire garden journey, and I've pretty much dialed in the ones I always want to have growing in my garden. So today I'm going to talk to you about those 11 herbs, why I grow each one, and how I use them. And my hope is that if you're not growing these, then maybe you'll be inspired to add a few of these in your garden this year. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure that you know, in case you haven't heard, I'm hosting a live online workshop on how to grow herbs, how to grow the most common kitchen herbs that most of us grow in our gardens. So a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today is which ones to grow and then how to use them once you actually start harvesting them. But if you're new and you need some tips on actually how to grow these herbs, we're going to go through, I think, almost all of these in the workshop. This is happening on Thursday, May the 16th, 2024. If you are listening to this or watching this on YouTube after that date, you can still get the replay. Your ticket will get you access to either the live, where we'll have live Q&A, or the replay that you can access throughout 2024. To get your ticket, go to journeywithjill.net/herb workshop. We'll have that link in the description, and I hope to see you there. So let's talk about the 11 herbs that I always want to make room for in my garden each year. And I'm going to separate these into two different categories. And then at the end, we're going to be talking about 4 medicinal herbs that I also am including in my garden this year. All of them are repeats, and they're herbs that I want to have in my garden for medicinal use, and I'll share more about that at the end. But first, let's talk about your kitchen herbs, and I'm going to divide these into 2 categories, annual herbs and perennial herbs. I'm going to describe more about perennial herbs when I get to that section, because depending on your zone, they may act as annual herbs for you. But first, let's talk about the annual herbs. Now, the annual herbs are ones that you're going to have to plant every year. So they're ones that they're going to grow, and then they're eventually going to flower and set seed and die, and then that's the way their life cycle goes. So you're going to be planting these every year. Number 1 on my list is basil. Basil is my favorite summer herb. I use it so often, but the reason why I want to grow this myself and why I encourage you to, especially if you use a basil at all in your kitchen, is it is so much cheaper to grow when you have it in your garden compared to buying the store-bought counterpart. I haven't even checked the price lately, but last time I checked, it was like $3 for a stem, and you can grow so much more basil than that. It's so much more cost effective. And plus, when you're picking out of your garden the essential oils in it that are going to be more flavorful, they're just going to create a better product for you in your kitchen. I also like that you can experiment with different varieties of basil. A lot of us think about the Italian green basil, and that's definitely the one that I always have in my garden. But it's also fun to grow different varieties of basil for different uses, like Thai basil for cooking, Tulsi basil for medicinal use. CM Queen basil is one of my favorites just for ornamental value because it's so beautiful. And then you've got lemon basil and cinnamon basil that tastes kind of like licorice. So you have all these different varieties, and they all grow pretty much the same way. They have a little bit different growth habit, but you have lots of different options. And with many of these, they're really beautiful additions in the garden. Plus, if you do let them go to flower, which some of them you won't, you'll want to pinch back so that you can keep harvesting really good leaves. But if you do let some go to flower, they are an amazing pollinator attractor. The bees absolutely love them. So that's one reason I like to have basil in my garden, especially toward the summer and the end of the season. They provide so much nectar for those bees at a time when a lot of the flowering wildflowers are scarce. Now, how I use basil in my kitchen, obviously fresh if I'm wanting to do bruschetta or pizza sauce or spaghetti sauce or anything like that, then I'm going to use them fresh when I have them. But my favorite way to use them, and this is just our family's preference, is in basil pesto. Mostly I use it in a particular dish that we have on repeat, but I've also used it just putting it on noodles because my kids actually love basil pesto. So I grow enough to eat that fresh, but then I also make the pesto and freeze it. And that way it's in my freezer year round, so I can eat basil pesto year round. And then of course drying basil, and then I can put it in my spice cabinet for use when a recipe calls for dried basil or during the off season. So basil is number one. Number two is parsley. Now, technically parsley is a biennial. It's not an annual. And what that means is that parsley is going to grow the first year, and then the following year, if it survives your winter, it's going to set seed, it's going to flower. Now, what makes this really cool about parsley is that if it does survive your winter and it does do its thing as a biennial, is that you will actually get parsley for a lot longer throughout the season. So if I'm planting it in March, like a transplant in March, I'm going to have fresh parsley most of the time all winter long. But even if you have a colder winter than I do, you're going to have it significantly longer than most of your other annual herbs. Another reason I like to have parsley in my garden is because, I don't know about you, but with the recipes that I use, usually it just requires a tablespoon of parsley as a garnish, or just something that it really makes a difference in the final product, of course, but it's kind of hard to justify a $3 pack of parsley just to have a tablespoon or two. And it's so much easier just to go outside on my patio and just clip a few leaves. And again, fresh, it tastes so much better. And another thing is it's easy to grow. You can buy it as a transplant. You can start it from seed indoors if you want, but I've just found the easiest way is to buy it as a transplant, and it lasts all season. How I use it fresh, like I mentioned before, but I also take some and I dry it and then grind it up to have a dried parsley in my spice cabinet. Number 3 in our annual herbs is dill. I grow dill because not only do you get fresh dill weed, the leaves part of it, but if you leave it, you'll also get dill seeds. So you have basically 2 in 1 there. And I use it personally fresh in any kind of recipes that call for it. Also, I will dry the leaves and then grind them up and have them in my cabinet to be able to use as needed. I use it when I'm making pickles, obviously dill pickles. And then I also use it dried in a ranch seasoning that I can use for dressing or dip. So those are the ways that I use dill. Number 4 is cilantro. Now, we talked about cilantro in the pizza garden episode, the salsa garden episode, a couple of episodes back. But I grow this because it seems like I'm constantly eating cilantro in different Mexican dishes, in salsas, in marinades, and all sorts of things. It seems like I use cilantro so much. And I use it mostly fresh when it's in season. And if you listen to that past podcast episode, you know that cilantro season is typically fall, winter, spring, depending on your climate. It's not necessarily in the summer. So I do try to freeze some for the summer. And this year I'm trying cilantro microgreens so that maybe I could have cilantro as microgreens in the middle of the summer. But cilantro would be number 4 in the annual herbs that I always grow in my garden. Now let's move on to perennial herbs. Now, a perennial herb is one that is going to, in its ideal state, in its ideal climate, it's going to last from year to year. It may die back a little bit in the winter. For example, my peppermint usually ends up dying back where you think it's dead, but then when spring comes, it comes back. So it may die back, it may not be lush and green, and you may not be able to harvest it all winter, but it'll still come back. Now, some you can harvest all winter, like thyme and oregano, I'm harvesting usually all winter long. But just know that if it dies back, it doesn't mean it's actually dead. However, some of these perennial herbs are more tender than others. So if you live in a climate where these herbs, rosemary is a good example. I've had rosemary die on me, even though I'm an 8A, zone 7B, and sometimes they can't take those cold snaps. So if you come across an herb that is perennial naturally, but it's not going to survive your winter, then you would treat it as an annual and you would plant it every year. So just understand, I'm talking about all of these in the context of they're all botanically perennial, but you'll need to check your zone to see if they're perennial in your area. Now, I'll be talking about all of this in the workshop in depth, but I also have a free download for you. It's called the Herb Planting Cheat Sheet, and this cheat sheet is a chart with most of these herbs. This cheat sheet has most of these herbs, and it gives you what zones that most of these are perennial to. It also gives details like how much water they need, how big you can expect them to get, and that kind of thing. I'll have that link in the description as well, so check that out to download that free guide for you, and that might be handy for you, especially as we're talking about these perennial herbs, so that you can know whether or not to expect it to last your winter. So number one on the perennial herb, and I'm not necessarily saying this is number one, like this is my first choice, but I just kind of listed them all out. But on my list here, number one is peppermint. I love growing peppermint because it has an enjoyable scent. I walk past it every time I go to my greenhouse, and a lot of times I'll just pluck a sprig or two and I'll just rub it between my fingers and I'll sniff it, and it just makes me happy. I love the scent of it. So just being able to have it to enjoy while I'm outside, not in any particular use per se, I do enjoy that. Sometimes I will just use it as nature's chewing gum. I'll just go outside and grab some, put it in my mouth, and it just freshens your mouth. I think that's kind of probably what people used to use it for before the advent of Wrigley's, right? So I really enjoy using that as well. In the summer, I'll pick some sprigs and I'll put it in a glass or a pitcher of ice water, and that will make peppermint infused water. It's super refreshing, especially in the middle of the summer. And then I also will use it in tea, hot tea, peppermint to any kind of teas, because I'm not usually an herbal tea drinker. I don't really love it, but if I add peppermint to it, a lot of times it makes it where I can get the other ones down a little bit better. And also it's really good for tummy troubles. For me anyway, if I'm having any kind of tummy issues, peppermint's my first go-to. And usually I'm steeping that in a hot tea. With peppermint, it also comes back year after year. It's one of those crops that you never want to plant outside of a container because you'll never kill it. But that's also a good thing because you plant it once and you're not going to have to plant it again. I think I've had one person that tells me that I've done the unimaginable. I killed my peppermint, and I'm like, please tell me your secret, because people want to know if anybody's accidentally planted it outside of a container. They're like, how do I get rid of this thing? But if you keep it in a container, then it comes back year after year and you only have to purchase it once. Number two on my perennial herb list is thyme. I keep thyme because I use it in cooking. I actually bought lemon thyme at Green Thumb Nursery a couple of years ago, and that's my primary thyme that I use. I love the lemony flavor in everything I use thyme in. The lemony flavor, it tastes really good, but regular thyme is just as good as well. And a lot of times dishes will call for thyme. Because the leaves are so small, even if it calls for dried thyme, I'll usually use fresh. But sometimes I do hang it dry and I'll have it in my spice cabinet if I need to, just maybe when it's really cold in the winter and I don't want to go outside, then it's nice to have it in the spice cabinet. But I use it fresh. I use it dried. I've also made it into a syrup that's supposed to be helpful for coughs, throats and coughs. That's something you could look up on your own, but I have done that before. Like most of these herbs, I'm talking about them as kitchen herbs because you're familiar with them and we use them mostly in our kitchen. But if you do any study on medicinal properties of herbs, all of these have medicinal properties of some sort. I'm just not getting into too much detail on these because most of the time we're using them in our kitchen, and most of the time they're going to impart some kind of medicinal benefit. So we can just know that anytime we add herbs to our diet, it's going to be helpful. Number three on my perennial herb list is rosemary. I grow rosemary because I like to use it in my kitchen. A lot of times we'll take sprigs and we'll grill with it, but I don't use it a ton. However, I love having it handy because when I do use it, I want to have it there. And like peppermint, the scent is uplifting. There's just something about that rosemary scent, and if you do any research on aromatherapy, you'll see this, that it really is helpful to just pick it and again, rub it between your fingers and just smell it. And it helps so much in so many ways. It's calming, it's invigorating. So sometimes I'll just go and use it that way, just for fun in my garden. I do use it fresh in cooking, like I mentioned, but I also sometimes will hang it dry and then put it in a spice bottle. And then it is one of the components of Italian seasoning that I make. So that's definitely another reason why I like to keep rosemary in my garden. And as I mentioned before, I added rosemary to the perennial list, but for many of us, rosemary may or may not survive our winter. For years, I had it come back year after year. And then the last couple of years, we've had some cold snaps and it's killed my rosemary. So it just kind of depends on your year, and it also depends on how well you cover it. I covered mine last year, but it didn't make it, so I had to buy a new plant. But it's okay. Fresh new plants, fresh new growth. It's good. Number 4 on my perennial kitchen herb list is probably the one that I use the most. So it probably should have been number 1, but that is oregano. I use it the most, both fresh and dried, in any type of Italian cooking, and using it fresh in recipes, dried in recipes. It's a main ingredient in pizza sauce. So oregano is just one of those herbs that gets used a lot. And like I said, in my garden, it does last the winter time, so I can go and harvest it most of the time all year. However, in the springtime, about now, and in the late summer, they produce a lot more. They produce fresh leaves, which makes it perfect to harvest at that point for drying. So even though you can harvest it all year round, if you want to harvest it and dry it for your spice cabinet, those are the ideal times of year. The beginning of the year before it starts to flower, and then it'll start to flower, and then it'll kind of die back in the summer depending on your climate. And then once those flowers die back, the herb will continue growing from the bottom, and then you'll get nice fresh growth of that herb that you can harvest before winter. Number 5 on my list, and I included this in the perennial herbs because technically it's a perennial, but it's not going to be a perennial for most of us, and that is marjoram. And I included it below oregano because marjoram and oregano are very similar. I actually have a podcast episode describing the difference between the two, and I think that's really important to know. If you're interested in this, go back to that episode. We'll put that link in the show notes or in the description. But I like to grow marjoram. This is kind of new. I think this is the 3rd year that I've grown it, because it is sweeter and it's milder than oregano. And I like to use it. It is a key ingredient in the Italian seasoning mix that I mentioned. I also, use it. I dry it for spice. And anytime I'm making something that might either call for oregano, but I don't really want that sharp oregano flavor. Maybe I want a more mild flavor. Sometimes I'll sub marjoram, or some recipes will call for either marjoram or oregano. And depending on the recipe, if I want something a little bit more sharp and strong, I'll choose oregano. But if I want something a little bit more mild, I'll choose marjoram. It's kind of a personal preference. But marjoram lasted all winter for me until we had that 0-degree cold snap. And even in the greenhouse with my heater, I think we stayed up in the 20s and it killed it. So other than that, it was pretty hardy. So I think it would probably last my winter if we didn't get one of those wild cold snaps. In zone 8A, we shouldn't, but we do. So it just depends on the winter whether it'll last over the winter for me. Number 6 on my perennial herbs list is chives. Chives is an easy to grow perennial because the first time that you plant it, if it gets established, it'll keep coming back year after year and it'll keep spreading. I'm finding chives in different places, not nearly as invasive as peppermint, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely one that will continue to spread. Another reason I love chives is because in the spring, usually in April in my climate, it boasts these beautiful purple blossoms. It's one of the first blossoms that I'm able to see. And it's gorgeous. The pollinators love it. It's like the herald of spring in my garden. It's absolutely a delight. And this year I'm actually trying something and I'm making chive blossom vinegar. I have heard of that. And the reason that I did it was because I ran out of my pickled beets. And so I'm trying different salad dressing recipes that I've never tried before. If you're new here, I use pickled beet vinegar to make a pickled beet vinaigrette for my salads. I know it sounds really crazy, but I love it. But I ran out of pickled beets, so I'm trying different recipes. And this year I've infused chive blossoms in vinegar to make a chive blossom vinegar, and I'm going to make that into a vinaigrette. We'll see how it goes. A lot of people take the chive blossoms and they just sprinkle them in their salads for a little bit of an oniony flavor, a mild oniony flavor. And then of course you use chives for cooking. So that's probably what you're more familiar with. And one reason too that I like to have chives in my garden is that I don't cook with a lot of recipes that call for chives, but when I do, it's kind of like parsley in the matter that it's kind of a garnish. It's kind of an afterthought. It's not usually the star of the show. And so it's kind of hard to justify, again, buying a $3 or $4 packet of chives at the store when it's just a minor ingredient. But being able to just go outside and pick them is, to me, the easiest way to do it, especially you buy it once. I can't remember if I started mine from seed or transplant. It's been so long ago, but you plant it once, and as long as it's in a good location, mine are in containers, then you're going to have it for years and years. So it's definitely one that's going to save you money in the long term, even if you only use chives a couple times a year. Number 7 in my perennial list is sage. I actually use sage very sparingly, but when I need it, it is so handy to have. It has a really short shelf life from the store. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if you buy sage from the store, sometimes it's already starting to brown. And when I'm harvesting my own sage, just like all the other herbs, the scent, the flavor is so much more intense in a good way. I'm trying to think of a better word for intense, but it's so flavorful compared to in the store. You don't know how old those herbs were, but you know that every minute that an herb is off the plant, it's losing its vigor. And you definitely get that if all you have to use is what you get at the grocery store. Now, no shame, all of us have to do it. But if you can grow your own, then I think you'll be able to see a huge difference in the flavor. And when you need it, it's so handy to have. Like I said, I use it sparingly. There's one recipe that I make every fall that I absolutely love. I think you can search for this on Pinterest if you want. It's sweet potato gnocchi, and I absolutely love it. Sage is a key ingredient along with broccoli and sweet potatoes. So all those things are kind of harvesting at once, and absolutely love it. But it's one of those things that I usually only make in the fall, but I love being able to go outside and harvest that fresh sage for that. Of course, I will dry it and then use it fresh in Thanksgiving dressing. It makes a huge difference compared to buying the ground sage at the grocery store. I also will use it in a cold care tea. Sage also has medicinal benefits, especially with sore throats. And sometimes this is something that may seem a little odd, but it has absolutely worked. Whether I have a sore throat or, this time of year when you get allergies and your throat just can't quit itching, I will just take a sage leaf and I'll just put it in my mouth and just use it as a lozenge. And you would be surprised at how it'll calm that itchiness down. It'll help soothe a sore throat. And that's just one of those things that I'd heard things about sage being good for this quality. And I thought, well, why not, instead of like making something elaborate, why not just, put the leaf in my mouth? And that definitely has helped. So sage is one, it lasts for me all year. It is perennial, and it's one that doesn't require a whole lot of upkeep. Most of these perennial herbs don't. You plant them once and they last, and you use them when you need them. And they're just so handy to be able to have available for you when you need them. Many of you have also asked me about medicinal herbs, and I am not an expert on this at all. I do have a couple of podcast episodes on that. One I think is with a guest, and I will probably be having another guest this year because I know so many of you guys are interested in that. And then I have one talking about different medicinal herbs that I grow, but I'm going to spotlight 4 that to me are ones that I've used enough to be able to kind of say that they're maybe my favorite or ones that I want to keep in my garden for one reason or another. But please understand that none of this is medical advice. Do your own research. As with anything, there can be allergies involved. There can be contraindications. So understand that what I'm sharing with you is how I use these herbs, but you definitely want to do your own research on that. Number 1 is Echinacea. Now, Echinacea is also known as coneflower. So this is one that does double duty in your garden because it's absolutely gorgeous, but it is a powerful antiviral. And I didn't believe it necessarily until I used it a few times, and I am an absolute believer. This past school year, don't tell my 17-year-old son that I've told you this, but he refused to take Echinacea tincture at all. I mean, it is the nastiest stuff. Don't get me wrong. It's awful. And in the past, he's been like, I'd rather be sick. But this year he needed to be in class. He didn't need to miss class. So he finally let me give it to him. And he did. He got better so much faster, like within a day. And again, I think when he's sick in the future, it's like, okay, do I want to be sick or do I want to take this stuff that almost makes me gag? So it is definitely a trade-off, but I use Echinacea tincture at the first sign of a cold, and almost all the time I'm over that cold in just a couple of days. And sometimes, it just depends on the cold, and it depends on how, worn out my immunity is and all that stuff. I know there's so many different variables, but it's definitely what I rely on. Now, Echinacea tincture is the most challenging part is that the best parts of the plant that you can use all the parts, the flower, the stems, the leaves, but the root is actually where most of the medicinal qualities are. And so that's something that you don't really want to harvest until the second or third year, because Echinacea is a perennial, and I don't want to harvest my whole plant because then I'd have to start all over again. I did start Echinacea from seed several years ago, but I didn't start harvesting the root until I think not the first, maybe the end of the second summer. But even then I didn't harvest very much. But what I do is I will tincture the root, some of the leaves, the flower. I'll do a tincture of all of it. And again, look up how to do this. I'm not the one to give you a tutorial on it. You can see ones online, but this is one that I always want to have because it is so important for me to have in my medicine cabinet. Number 2 is lemon balm. Lemon balm is one you may be growing anyway, just because it has so many uses that are beyond medicinal. I love it because of its lovely smell, just like peppermint, just like the other rosemary I was telling you about. I will just go and I'll pick lemon balm and I'll just smell it because it is so uplifting. But it also makes a very calming tea, whether you drink it hot or sometimes I'll just put it in my ice water in the summer. And I've also found it to be very powerful for any kind of cold sores, like on your lip or on your mouth. And just like with sage, I'll just take a leaf and I'll just kind of rub it between my fingers to get those essential oils kind of agitated. And then I'll just lay it on my mouth or wherever I need that antiviral action. And again, I am not a medical professional at all, but I can tell you when I've done it. And even my daughter, she had a sore recently on her mouth, and I gave her that, and she just looked at me like I had 3 heads, but she did it. And then like 2 days later, it was gone. So that's definitely something that it's nice to have outside when you need it, to be able to go pick. So I do use it fresh, as I mentioned before, but I do dry it so that I can have it available for tea when it's not vigorous. Lemon balm is one that will come back year after year for me, but it will die back. So I don't have the leaves to be able to harvest throughout the winter. Number 3 is Yaro. I love Yaro because it's a beautiful flower. It's a great addition to the landscape. Pollinators love it, but it has a lot of medicinal qualities. The main reason that I like using and having Yaro is that it is very good. And again, please do your research on this and please use like common sense. If there's a major wound, Yaro's not going to be the magic pill, but if you have something minor, it will stop bleeding fairly rapidly. Like I've, cut my finger with a knife, and like a kitchen knife, and Yaro is the first place I go. Again, please do your research on this and don't take this as first aid. This is just how we use it as in our family. But Yaro has a lot of other medicinal properties to them. You can look that up. I just use it mostly for first aid needs. And Yaro in my zone does come back year after year. So that makes an easy crop to be able to just plant it and then enjoy the beauty and then let it go, and then it'll come back. And number 4 is kind of a new crop for me. This will be the 3rd year that I'm growing it, and that is Spilanthes. It's also known as the toothache plant. I like growing it because it's a very pretty plant, very dark green leaves, and its flower looks like multicolored gumdrop. I mean, it's so unique. And I like to have it in my garden because it's medicinal when I need it. If you have any kind of sore on your mouth or on your tooth, that's why it's called the toothache plant. It's really good to numb that pain. Now, I haven't looked up whether it's safe for infants, so please don't do that. But I just remember when my kids were teething or if I had some kind of wound, then, that Orajel or whatever that would numb it. That's kind of the action that I have felt when I've used the Spilanthes. But again, please do your research. Do not use any herbs on kids until you've researched it. Most of these herbs that I've started to use, my kids were much older and I didn't have to research any of this. So if you have young kids, please research that. But I have found it to be very helpful because it's an analgesic and it helps to numb the pain. Now, and it will numb it. So you got to be careful. I have to be careful how much you use it because it's pretty strong. One year when I got a summer cold and I had a sore throat, I ended up making a tea with it and it was soothing to the sore throat. But again, it had some numbing action, so it's kind of weird. But I like to be able to have it handy and available when I need it. So those are the 11 kitchen herbs I would not be without in my garden, and then the 4 medicinal herbs that kind of top my list. There are more that I use, but those are the main ones that this year when I was planning my garden, I was like, okay, I want to make sure and have these. Now, the kitchen herbs in particular, as I mentioned before, if you're interested in growing them and growing them successfully, it's really not hard to grow herbs once you get the basics of when to plant and what kind of growth habit they have and how big do you expect them to grow, and lots of different care things to know, which isn't complicated, but because once you know it, it's easy. But I'm going to go through all of those step by step in this herbs workshop. And if you're watching this or listening to this live, this will be on Thursday, May 16th, which is only 2 days away. I'll teach you when to plant, when these herbs grow the best, how many you need. That's the thing. Some of these herbs, I grow lots of them, and some of them I grow one. So we're going to talk about how many that you need, and then whether to expect them year after year, how to care for them throughout the season. We're going to go through all of that in depth. Usually these workshops are about an hour to an hour and a half, and we do have Q&A usually in the middle and at the end. So if you have questions on how to grow these herbs, then I'm there with you live. But again, if you are catching this after we have already done this, this is one that would be great on replay just to be able to get your ticket, to be able to watch it. You'll have a downloadable workbook to take notes and make a plan for yourself. This is a great time of year for most of us to begin adding these herbs into our garden. And hopefully through this episode, I've convinced you how beneficial they can be in your garden. Now you can get your ticket to the workshop at journeywithjill.net/herb workshop. And even if you're catching this later, that link will still send you to get your ticket to the replay, and you'd be able to have access to it throughout 2024. And don't forget, we also have that free herb planting cheat sheet for you. Whether or not you decide to attend the workshop, I hope that you will download that because that will get you started on many of these herbs as well. So I would love to know from you, are you growing all of these herbs? Would you add any to my list? What are your thoughts on all these? Please comment below. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Beginner's Garden Podcast. And if you ever want to watch on the go, you can subscribe at your favorite podcasting player. I hope you have a great day.